This is just a quick example of how to calculate relative prices and how to construct country production possibility frontiers. I'm referring to the lecture example where we have US and China producing cloth and wheat. We've calculated in previous slides the productivity, which is the units of cloth or wheat produced per hour for each country. We're now going to use this productivity to determine the relative prices of these goods. So underneath we're going to do opportunity cost or relative price of cloth and wheat in the US and China. When we're doing relative price, we're basically valuing these goods in terms of each other. So how many units of wheat do we need to produce one cloth in each country? And how many units of cloth do we need to produce one wheat in each country? What I've just written is basically what we have to divide by what in the productivity table. So let's do the first one. How many units of wheat do we have to produce, give up to produce 1 unit of cloth? Well, what we simply do is we divide this wheat by cloth. Wheat productivity by cloth productivity. So 0.5 divided by 0.25 is 2. So we give up 2 units of wheat to produce 1 unit of cloth. Let's do the same in China. Wheat over cloth, 0.67 over 1. We give up 1 unit of wheat to produce an additional unit of cloth. Same thing for the wheat. So in this case, we're dividing the cloth by the wheat. Why? Because we're valuing wheat in terms of cloth. How many units of cloth do we have to give up to produce an additional unit of wheat? So 0.25 over 5 is 1/2. So we need to give up half a unit of cloth to produce an extra unit of wheat. And here, cloth over wheat, 1 over 0.67 is approximately 1.5. So we have to give up 1.5 units of cloth to produce 1 unit of wheat. Now we're going to graph these two. And in order to graph them, we have to be given some information. And the information that's relevant is that both the US and China have 100 billion hours of labor. So what we can do is now draw the PPF for both countries. So US, China. We're going to put wheat on the Y and cloth on the x-axis. This will be wheat and cloth in billions of units per year. Why billions of units per year? Because we've been given 100 billion hours for each economy. So we're valuing it in billions. Okay. In order to draw these graphs, we actually have to go back to the hours that it takes us to produce each good. You might remember that if you go back a few slides, that the labor hours to make each, so this is labor hours, the labor hours to make each was 4 and 2 for cloth and wheat, and 1 and 1.5. So this is just the number of hours it takes to make a cloth or a wheat. So we've got 100 billion hours now, and in the US, it takes 4 hours to make 1 unit of cloth. So how much cloth can they make with 100 billion hours? It's 100 billion divided by 4. So here, in cloth in the US, we've got 100 billion divided by 4, which gives us 25 billion units of cloth if we spend all of our time producing cloth. So we've done that one. Now, if we spend all of our time producing wheat in the US, it takes us 2 hours to produce 1 unit of wheat. We have 100 billion hours, so 100 divided by 2, which means that if we spend all of our time producing wheat, we can produce 50 billion units of wheat. Now, this then becomes the PPF. This is very important this connection I'm going to show you will come up again and again in the course later on. What is the slope of this line? Remember, slope is rise over run. So 50 over 25 equals 2. The slope of this line is actually the price of cloth. Here we have calculated the relative prices. The price of cloth is 2 wheat per cloth. Cloth is on the x-axis, which develops the rule that we're going to use again and again, that the slope of this line, rise over run, is the price of whatever's on the x-axis. 2 is the price of cloth in the US. Whereas the inverse of the slope, which is a half, is the price of wheat in the US. Let's do the same thing in China. So China similarly has 100 billion labor hours. If China spent all of its labor hours producing cloth, it takes 1 labor hour to produce 1 unit of cloth. So if they spent 100 billion labor hours to produce cloth, they could produce 100 billion units of cloth. How about wheat? If they spent all of their time producing wheat, it takes 1.5 hours to produce 1 unit of wheat. They have 100 billion hours. So 100 divided by 1.5 is approximately 67. So in China, what is the slope of this PPF? The slope is rise over run, which is 67 over 100. Now, 67 over 100 is 0.67. Looking up here, we can see that that is actually the price of cloth. So the slope of the line is the price of whatever is on the x-axis. Let's just use these graphs for a minute to compare the two economies. Can you see that the PPF in China is overall larger than the PPF in the US? So it's allowing the economy to produce and consume at a higher point, which means or reflects the fact that China has absolute advantage in everything. If both economies before trade start off at point S0, point S0 in China is higher than point S0 in the US. It has absolute advantage. Now, the theory of comparative advantage asserts that the country with the lowest opportunity cost of producing a good, so they give up the least amount to produce a good, will specialize perfectly in that good. So in the US, let's have a look. The price of cloth and wheat is 2 and 1/2. In China, the price of cloth and wheat is 0.67 and 1.5. Who has the lower price of cloth? Well, it seems to be China. They only give up 0.67 units of wheat for 1 unit of cloth. Who has the cheapest price of wheat? The US. It only gives up 1/2 a unit of cloth to produce 1 unit of wheat. So now these countries are going to perfectly specialize in these two areas. The US is going to produce here, so it's going to specialize in wheat. So this will be its production point S1. It's going to spend all of its labor hours producing wheat. As we know, that means they can produce 50 billion units of wheat. China, on the other hand, is going to perfectly specialize in cloth. So their new production point is going to be S1. Now, how do we, using these new production points with trade, how do we draw the PPF with trade? In order to do this, we need a world price. Now, you do not have to determine the world price. In any assessment, this will be given to you. Let me just show you how the world price is determined. Let's look at the price of cloth. The price of cloth is here. So in the US, the price of cloth is 2 wheat, given up for a unit of cloth. In China, 0.67. So the world price has to fall somewhere in between there. I'm going to arbitrarily choose a world price of 1 for the price of cloth. So we give up 1 wheat per unit of cloth. So the international price of cloth is 1 wheat. As I've told you before, the slope of this line is always going to be the price of whatever's on the x-axis. So the slope of the new trade line has to be 1 in both countries. if I draw the new trade lines as follows, and I'm wondering what this point is here, how I figure it out is that I know that the slope of these new trade lines has to be what? 1. It has to be 1 because, as I've said before, the slope of this line is the price of whatever is on the x-axis. The world price of what is on the x-axis, or cloth, is 1. So this is 50, and we want it to be 1, so this must also be 50 to give a slope of 1, and this must also be 100. That's how we get the international trade line for the two countries. What you can see by looking at these trade lines is that both economies can now consume outside of their PPF. They're no longer limited by what they themselves can produce. So in the US, people can now consume more cloth that they're importing from China, and in China, people can consume more wheat that they're importing from the US. This is demonstrating the fact that even though China has absolute advantage in everything, you can still have a trade situation where both economies benefit when both economies specialize in the good in which they have comparative advantage.